Hello class, Professor Yi here, and welcome to Soundbites for week 2. I'm recording this video on the go at my office, so it's not going to be quite as high-tech. The sound quality is also a little different. Now this lecture is taken from another course in a previously existing teaching video that I think is well adapted to serve the purpose in this class of introducing the digital revolution. But because of that, it kind of starts midway, so let me just set it up a little for our purposes. So last week we saw a history of physical music technology, starting from notation and means of mechanical sound reproduction, on up down to sound recording with things like the vinyl, cassette tape, or the CD. With the CD, we officially get into the realm of digital audio, because as I mentioned last week, the CD starts to convert audio signals by sampling them and converting them into data of zeros and ones. So in a more encoded format rather than in analog or directly engraving the waveform in some form onto a piece of medium, as was the case with tape or vinyl. Well, the CD really heralds our way into the digital revolution, which marks the musical paradigm that we know today, where most music is digitally produced, digitally transmitted, and digitally consumed. So this week's lecture and materials forms a natural transition point into the rest of the course, which is primarily going to be looking at digital audio in a hands-on way through the digital audio workstation. And so we'll set up some of that history and the DAW's capabilities here. Now normally in this lecture I would demonstrate my DAW of choice, which is Logic Pro, through one of the projects that I've created in it. However, because in this class we're actually focusing on Ableton Live instead, I'm going to hold off on the DAW demonstration and tutorial type stuff until next week, where I'll do a pretty extensive demonstration of Ableton there, and just start to dip our toes in this week to the Ableton side, but mostly stick with considering different topics that arise when we look at the digital revolution. So some of these include the topic of real recorded audio versus virtual instruments, and if the ear can tell the difference. Music piracy, now that music can be copied as MP3 or WAV files, what does that mean for ownership of music and for services like Napster that had disrupted using music piracy and disrupted the normal sales flow of the music industry, and things like streaming royalties when we get on down to the present of how music is digitally streamed out and consumed. What are the ramifications for that streaming paradigm when it comes to artists' livelihood? Those are just a few of the topics that we'll be looking at. Now, none of them will be able to go into an extreme amount of depth. That's, again, left to other courses. But I wanted to just raise these questions so we're aware of them as we go through the rest of the course. And by raising these topics, ask the question of, have there been serious trade-offs in moving to a digital music paradigm over, let's say, the physical recorded paradigm of the vinyl record, or even before that when music was only live. And so some of our readings will help us to start to do that and discuss via flip. Alright, and with that being said, we'll go ahead and transition into the previously recorded lecture, which will pick up where we left off, learning about the various recording formats like vinyl, cassette tape, and the CD. So far we've looked at means of listening to music, such as CDs versus tape and the vinyl record, but today we'll be looking more at the production angle, how music is produced using digital means rather than simply analog ones, such as recording sound to tape in a studio. And so to that end, we're going to be looking a lot this week at the digital audio workstation, which is sort of the tool that ties all the different aspects of the digital evolution within music together. I want to start with this quote by producer Oak Felder from an interview in a video that you'll be watching in this week's materials. Felder says, "I think technology has become the great equalizer. I think we're all on an even playing field, and now it's just about skill. Now it's about who's just good." So what are we talking about when we talk about the digital audio workstation? Here's a screenshot of a DAW called Logic Pro, which I'll be showcasing at the end of this video. As you can see, there are a number of different tracks arranged vertically, and in this case color-coded, and within them they either have MIDI data or audio data, that is recorded audio. And as the playhead scrolls across horizontally, you'll hear the audio played back in real time. There are a number of different effects and edits that you can apply, such as you see at the bottom of the screen. And that's a digital audio workstation in a nutshell. It's the most powerful software for recording, mixing, and editing your audio projects and your music. A good comparison would be the digital revolution in terms of visual images with the invention of Photoshop within the industry. So let's begin by talking about an overview of the DAW. As I mentioned, this is called the Digital Audio Workstation, DAW, and it is the epicenter of the digital revolution in music. Now, originally the DAW was designed to address particular problems, and that was the hiss, noise, or distortion that would be inherent and in some degree inevitable whenever recording music to tape. Some of your sources alluded to this earlier when we had the analog versus digital discussion, but whenever you're working with physical mediums of sound, such as a vinyl record, there tends to always be some level of surface noise, or noise that's added by the operation of the physical media itself. However, with the digital audio workstation, that's not relevant because it's all happening in software. Now, the first DAW released in 1976 from a company called Soundstream. The program was called Digital Editing System. Now, that didn't really last until the modern day, but in 1984, a company called Avid released Sound Designer, which is known today as Pro Tools, and was for at least a couple decades really the standard DAW in the industry. Another one that's worth noting is Mark of the Unicorn, a company that you probably know today as Motu, the abbreviation of Mark of the Unicorn. They released a software called Performer, which later became known as Digital Performer. And again, Digital Performer was one of the main DAWs for the next couple decades. Now, as I'll show later, the UI for a DAW replicates the look of a multi-track tape recorder and a sound mixing board, sort of smashed together. So in other words, this software is directly inspired by the standard tools that were being used at the time to record and produce music. It was made to be an equivalent to those tools. And even things that you would have in a recording studio, such as pedal effects or a reverb rack that you could daisy chain your signal through, these things are all represented in the layout and the UI of the DAW. So you can insert that reverb plugin. You can insert your pedal board and things like that. So it's all made to be familiar to musicians who are used to recording live in a studio. So what are some features and advantages to the DAW? Well, first and foremost is the potentially unlimited tracks within the software. Now, eventually you get capped by file size and by processing power within the computer, but as you'll see in one of the videos that you watch, this is far, far more than you could ever really use. So you have potentially unlimited tracks for the purposes of making a song. This is a big change from recording to tape or even multi-track tape recorders, which tended to be capped at 8, such as the 8-track tape recorder, or 16, or maybe at most 32, and you'd have to make your whole song on those 32 tracks of tape. However, for the DAW, no problem. You can have 200, 300, 500 tracks, and as long as your computer handles it fine, there's no issue. There's also a feature called automation that I'll showcase later, which is being able to tweak the volume or other parameters of your tracks up and down at specific points and program that in instead of having to move it yourself. So in a live studio recording session, if they wanted to have less drums at a certain point in the track, they would need to move down the fader or the gain on the channel for the drums in real time. And so it sort of became a coordinated dance with multiple people where you would move one fader down and someone else would move the fader up, and it was called riding the faders. However, in a DAW, you can program all that motion into the box. So instead of having multiple people to ride the faders, you just program it to go up at a certain point or down. And finally, another major advantage is the use of plugins or VSTs, which we'll be covering later on its own slide. Some examples of DAWs that are popular today are Ableton Live, Logic Pro, which I'll be demonstrating, Pro Tools, Cubase, Reaper is a popular newcomer, FL Studio, and Audacity on the free end. Now let's talk about the bedroom studio. Now today, bedroom studio producers and composers are becoming increasingly common and able to achieve really spectacular results just from a simple setup like what I'll describe. Just as one example, and one that you'll see listed in your materials, the artist Jacob Collier is one that's sort of famous for taking this bedroom studio approach, doing all the instrumentals and vocals himself with some virtual instruments, and creating some fantastic tracks as a result. Now, with the advancement of technology, audio recording gear has become vastly more portable and shrunk down into a form that an individual person can set up and can operate themselves. So here's a list of some gear that you might need if you want to construct your own bedroom studio. For your essential gear, first you'll need a computer. Now, the basic user-level computers, such as a MacBook Pro, tend to do just fine for the purpose of recording music. You might want to soup up the model just a little bit in terms of RAM and storage, but basically what is on the market now will work. Then you'll need your digital audio workstation software of choice. For example, Logic, Ableton, Reaper, Pro Tools, and so on and so forth. If you want to live record anything, such as vocals or guitar maybe, you'll need a microphone in order to live record that sound. For example, the Shure SM58, that's S-H-U-R-E, is a great starter microphone to pick up, or a USB microphone such as a Blue Snowball. If you are recording with a microphone or a live instrument such as an electric guitar, you'll need some cabling, such as TRS or quarter-inch cables, or XLR cables, mostly for microphones. Now, you'll need either a good pair of studio headphones or a pair of good studio monitors, that is, speakers. The studio headphones tend to be cheaper for what you get, so I would recommend those in the essential category, especially if you can get noise-canceling ones so you can really hone in on the quality of your mix. And then finally, this might not be in the essential category, but I consider it to be so universal as to be essential, and that is a MIDI keyboard controller. We'll learn more about MIDI next week, but basically this is a keyboard controller that will let you input data to control your virtual instruments and play in that data in real time. So it goes much, much faster using a MIDI keyboard than if you want to type it in using your mouse and keyboard. For some important gear that most setups would probably have but not be strictly necessary would be an audio interface. This is especially for recording live instruments, and it helps you convert the electric sound signal of, for example, an electric guitar or anything that has a pickup into a signal that can be read by your digital audio workstation directly. So this tends to get you a cleaner signal than if you put your guitar through an amp and then record it with a microphone. You'll also probably want some virtual instrument libraries, especially if you're planning on working with anything orchestral, with the classical instruments. Also, if you're going to be recording your vocals or MIDI instruments, you'll probably want microphone stands. You'll want to pick up studio monitors or speakers if you didn't get those with the essential gear. And then you might want effects plugins as well beyond the standards that come packaged with your DAW. This may include things like your favorite reverb plugin or an equalizer, just various things that will shape the tone of the audio that you record. And now for some nice-to-haves, which are really not necessary, but could make your life a lot easier while recording. First, we have a pop filter. This goes over your microphone to stop from getting unwanted mouth noises when you're recording vocals. Then there are external hard drives, which can be really helpful if you're storing and amassing sample libraries. Make sure you get ones with a fast connection to your computer, because if your DAW is reading actively the samples off of this hard drive, you can run into latency issues if that connection is not very fast. Then you could also acquire a USB digital mixer. This is usually just a panel of 1 or 2 faders, although it can be more. That lets you do automation with a tactile touch. So if you're used to working a soundboard and writing a fader up or down at certain points, or want to do sort of some sweeping motions with it, this can be an easier way to do it than clicking in all the automation point by point. Then for your studio monitor set, you might want to get a subwoofer if you're working with a lot of bass-heavy music, such as in hip-hop and EDM. And then, while I mentioned virtual instruments and plugins for the important gear section, it's worth reiterating for the nice-to-haves that you can get more virtual instruments and plugins. This is a quest that will never end for music producers and composers. You can put thousands upon thousands and tens of thousands of dollars worth of virtual instruments and plugins into your setup, and still the companies will come out with the latest new thing that you just have to have. So it's very easy, in some ways tempting and snowballing, addictive even, to just get into reinvesting your profits to buy the next library and the next library. I've been there, so I know how it goes. And so half the battle really comes to deciding which libraries do you really need versus which ones are just flexing. And then finally, multiple monitor screens. When you're running a high-powered DAW like Logic, eventually you'll start to get so many different windows open that you'll really benefit from having 3, even 4 screens that you can move different panes to. So maybe you'll have your main arrange window in one screen, your mixing window in another, your MIDI piano roll in another, and some of your plugins open on your 4th screen. I definitely have multiple screens for my setup, and I recommend it for you as well. Now, operating with a bedroom studio isn't just all advantages. There are some challenges involved. First of all, there's noise bleed, which is probably the main challenge in working in a bedroom studio. In a professional recording studio, you have sound-treated rooms, and your sound booth that has the engineers is completely walled off in a sound-treated area. So the only sounds that you're going to be picking up are those from within your room. And some studios are even treated to the point where you don't hear any electrical hum from the lights. It's just that well treated. However, when you're working in a bedroom studio, this is pretty much never the case. Even if you install special padding and sound-resistant materials in your studio, you're still going to be picking up some sound and noise bleed from the outside world, especially if you have a window in your studio. And you never know when, for example, in the middle of your take, an airplane will fly by or a train whistle, and then that's ruined the take. Another issue is recording space. In a professional recording studio, you get a large room, usually way larger than you could ever use. However, in a house or an apartment, even when you're recording from your bedroom setup, it's most of the time not possible to have all the band in one room if you're recording with a band or an ensemble. So that means either finding ways to extend your setup through different rooms of the house through very jury-rigged ways, or recording people one at a time, which might be the best solution, but certainly doesn't have the liveness that a band playing together would usually have. And finally, this is mentioned in one of your long reading articles, but the need for multiple perspectives, which is so important in music creation. When you're in a bedroom studio and you're working on your mix, you've recorded your tracks and you're working on finalizing your mix, thinking about should I add a virtual instrument, a plugin, things like that, it's just you in your own head at that point, making those considerations. If you are working in a recording studio, you usually have a mixer, someone who's a dedicated set of ears listening to what you're doing and can give you advice and feedback based on how you're doing. The Beatles, again, would never have made it as far as they did without George Martin that was doing that job for them. However, for the bedroom studio, this is usually a luxury for most composers and producers today, which means they need to go out of their way to really find peers and other collaborators that can give them advice on their mixes and on their compositions. Next, let's talk about virtual instruments, which I think is one of the most fascinating and relevant topics that we cover in this course. So virtual instruments at their core are instruments that you can play through your digital audio workstation to create sounds of instruments that you don't have present. For example, in my setup, I have access to the sound of a piano. I could record that sound with a microphone, or I could put it in through my audio interface and get it directly. But it would still just be the sound of a piano. What if instead of just that sound of a piano, through playing the MIDI keyboard and going through my digital audio workstation, I could instead play the sound of a trumpet, a flute, an oboe, a violin, a whole string section, an orchestra, a shakuhachi, a vihuela, a synthesizer, a drum set. All of those possibilities are open to me through virtual instruments. Literally, the possibilities are endless. So a VST stands for Virtual Studio Technology, and it's a plugin designed to work in the DAW. Usually this either comes with your DAW, like with Logic, comes with about 60 gigabytes worth of different instruments, or it's a sample library or instrument that you purchase separately and then plug into your DAW. Now there are 3 types of VST plugins. There's VST Instruments, or VSTIs, there's VST Effects, and VST MIDI effects. Now, VST-I plugins, often just shorthand for virtual instruments, they take MIDI input, such as from your MIDI keyboard, which usually consists of pitch, velocity, and duration. That's how it encodes the note that you have performed. And it takes that MIDI data and it produces audio out of that. So VST-Is take MIDI input and they produce audio. They approximate it as audio of the instrument, such as by a trumpet. Now, the VST effects take that audio and they further transform it. So this is through things, effects like reverb, EQ, equalizers, or guitar pedals like wah or delay. And most of these VST effects plugins in some way approximate existing hardware within the studio. The one I haven't mentioned yet is VST MIDI effects, and that's because they're the least interesting and the least common out of all of them. In fact, I can't even think of a VST MIDI effect that you would have to buy. But it could do things such as take your MIDI and transpose it, so maybe it all transposes it up an octave, up a fifth. Maybe it takes the notes and conforms it to a different scale. So you can say, take this passage I just played in C major and change it instead to D Lydian, and it would do that. It would conform it to the scale. You can also use randomize, which is going to take all the MIDI data and sort of scooch it over by a little bit in time, randomizing it, or even randomize the pitch. So take a whole bunch of C major scale pitches and you'll randomize and move it to any of the chromatic notes. Those are VST MIDI effects, but honestly most of those tend to come built into your DAW and you don't have to spend extra money on them. Now within the category of virtual instruments, there's a separate branch into synthesis and sampling. And this is an important distinction. So a virtual instrument that is a synthesizer will be creating the audio by adding layer upon layer. So like starting with a very slow, low frequency oscillator and then adding that or modulating it by more and more frequencies to create a more complex sound. The predecessor of this form of creating audio is the organ, because as we mentioned, the pipe organ, the king of instruments, would start with a certain like naked tone and then add on to that different sounds, like the sound of a flute, the sound of a trumpet, and sort of make the sound more complex by adding in these stops. And so if you pull out all the stops, then you have the most complex sound. That's synthesis in a nutshell. On the other hand, you have sampling, which is represented by the mellotron, which I'm not sure if we've actually brought up at this point in the course, but it's an instrument that would take strings of tape, and when you push the corresponding key for that piece of tape, it would just play the tape. So the concept for sampling libraries comes from the mellotron. Let's say for the mellotron, like the Beatles, we wanted to record a string quartet playing different notes on the keyboard. So you have all the strings play a C, and you record that tape, put in the mellotron. You have all the strings play a D, record that, put in the mellotron. So you do that over and over again until you have all the notes on the mellotron. Well, now whenever you play the mellotron, when you play the note C, it's going to play the tape of those strings bowing a C. When you play D, plays the tape that has the Ds. And so that gives you access to all the potential notes of that string quartet. So the important thing to note here is that rather than creating the sound from scratch, a sampler is taking recorded sound from a particular instrument or set of instruments, and when you're triggering it with a certain note, in this case a MIDI note, then it's playing back that sample that was already recorded. So a sample library, such as of a trumpet, is going to take the recording of that trumpet playing every note, and then with all those snippet recordings that you got from the trumpet, you can put them together in a library and code it up. And now when you're playing your MIDI keyboard, you're basically playing a trumpet, because each time you trigger a MIDI note, it'll trigger the corresponding sound file from the sample library. That's how sampling works. Now, working with virtual instruments has a number of advantages. First and foremost, the ability to correct your MIDI data. This means if you make a mistake while recording a part in, you can just go back in and change that note. So you accidentally hit a C when you meant to play a D, just drag that MIDI data up. Or if you're a little bit out of time, you can quantize and help drag those events into the proper place. Also, working with virtual instruments gives you an immediate mock-up of the sound. So let's say you're a film composer and you're scoring a particular scene. Well, you want to immediately be able to watch back what you just scored with the movie and make sure that it fits the tone you're going for. Virtual instruments allow you to do that. Of course, virtual instruments take less space than real instruments, less physical space, and also have less setup time as a result. Virtual instruments also have a great deal of customization of tone, as well as give you access to rare instruments that you probably wouldn't be able to find a player for if you wanted to live record. Earlier I mentioned the shakuhachi as just one example. And so you can find many rare instruments with just a quick, maybe $70 library, and you have access to the sound of that instrument. However, what are some of the disadvantages to virtual instruments? Well, the main ones tend to be the trade-offs in realism, that is how real the instrument sounds and the music sounds, and especially in the vein of expressivity, emotional expressivity. As we'll talk about, virtual instruments generally don't sound as real or as human as live recorded. There's also the quirk of having to play from the keyboard itself, from the piano. Now, this is a more nuanced point that might land more for those of you who have played musical instruments before, but composing and thinking about musical lines, it tends to be different depending on if you're approaching it from a keyboard perspective or from the perspective of the instrument itself. So, for example, if you're working with a violin or an acoustic guitar, the parts that you come up for it would be different if you actually have the instrument in your hand and are fingering, or for the guitar, fingering those chords, than if you're playing it on the piano. And oftentimes you could end up writing things that sound more unrealistic or not suited to the instrument if you're composing it originally from the piano in the first place. So that's that point. And then finally, when you're working with virtual instruments, the tone tends to sound too clean or too smooth, and this has to do with the realism of the instrument again. When you record live instruments, whether it's an acoustic guitar, an electric guitar, a violin, a trumpet, a timpani, there tends to be more roughness to the sound because of how the sound waves develop in the room, because of the sounds of the physical implements used to produce sound, whether that's your nails or the bow or the stick on the drum. And those are things that even when you're recording from a sample library and using those recordings, tend not to be as present in the sound with a sample library. But when everything is more uniform and smoothed over for mass packaging and marketability, that means the performance is also less individual. And so you don't hear, for example, the fingers scraping over the guitar strings as they move from one chord to another. That's what happens when you use virtual instruments. So that takes us into talking about virtual versus real when you're recording or producing your project. And I want to raise the question, do virtual instruments have an upper threshold of realism or expression, a sort of a glass ceiling past which the virtual instrument will never go beyond? I think the answer to that might be yes. It might well be that the human expressivity of, for example, a violin playing a solo with interpretation and with rubato, pushing the tempo in some places, pulling back in others, and the careful dynamic shaping can never be fully approximated by a virtual instrument and a composer trying to imitate that no matter how hard. I've certainly been on the composer end before trying to create that very expressive violin or oboe or flute solo, and it's very difficult and time-consuming. So composers end up spending a lot of time and receiving a lot of training learning to fudge the virtual instrument passages to sound more human, which is to say to sound more imperfect. But what does this mean for the listener? Well, media music's reliance on virtual instruments, whether it be for video games, film, or television, and the fact that the virtual instruments themselves are improving in their sound for realism, and to the point where many audience ears can't tell the difference between that and the real record version, and also becoming more used to the virtual instrument style than the real life equivalent, means that more and more of these virtual instrument cues are actually being used and make it to the final product, not just in the mock-up. So what does that mean if I as a composer can now just play in my trumpet parts, play in my timpani parts, and have that track be the one that makes it into the final film? Well, what it means is it's going to thin out the budget, because now instead of having to pay a trumpet player or pay a timpani player to come and record that part. It's just me in my bedroom playing out those parts. So that means it also thins the recording opportunities for live session musicians, especially for those that play orchestral instruments, like a trumpet or like a violin. However, it also puts more pressure on the composer to maintain an up-to-date arsenal of sample libraries that will sound as realistic and competitive as other composers out there. And as I mentioned, this costs thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars to do. The Vienna Symphonic Library Complete, for example, costs $20,000 in all. So it's a big investment just to stay competitive in the market. So in the end, what the reliance on virtual instruments could mean is more and more financial investment and burden on the composers, more time investment on the composers to make their tracks sound just as perfect and realistic as possible, and actually fewer work opportunities for working musicians, for example, particularly in the Los Angeles area, where media music sessions, recording sessions have tended to take place. But in one sense, there's no use crying over spilled milk, because virtual instruments are here, for better or for worse, to stay. And there's no way to just ban virtual instrument track use in, say, a theatrical film or in a final television show, because these days most professional songs, most film or TV trailers, most TV scores, and even many film scores will feature a blend of virtual instruments and live recorded instruments. Many video games and many television scores are entirely virtual instruments, or only live records like vocals and guitar, things that the composer can find access to easily. But the strings, the orchestra, the brass, all of that will often be through sample libraries. And so it is that our music and listening habits, as in so much of the rest of our lives, is a blend of the virtual and the real. And maybe that's just what it means to be a human, the human condition in the 21st century.